Good afternoon. It is great to see everyone for our newest Lunch and Learn. There is a time in your life when you have a teacher whose teaching and work touches you deeply, and that is the case with Rabbi Sarah Mulhern and me. It is as if you have been interested in a topic your whole life, and then you find one of those knowledgeable people on it. And that was my case with learning from Sarah. She is an incredible teacher. I met her initially through the Hartman Institute. And since that time, she is now affiliated with them still, but also now in Chicago, working there in the Jewish community, and just an incredible faculty member and person. And we are so excited to have her with us for the rest of the month of January on the topic of what Jewish texts and gender ethics and power. Rabbi Mulhern serves as the rabbi of Base. I'm assuming it's LNCLN, LNCLN, opening her home and her heart to young Jewish adults.
Lincoln, it's just supposed to be
Oh, it's
trending.
Lincoln. Okay. In Israel, the Lincoln Street's pronounced LNCLN. So it had echoes of that for me. And her heart to young adults in Lincoln Park, Chicago. She passionately believes that Torah matters and that Judaism can enrich human life and better society. She is a faculty member of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, of which myself and Rabbi Levin are fellows of the Institute as well, have served in their RLI program, and a nationally regarded adult education teacher. She created, of which I was a part of, the Created Equal Project, Hartman Institute's research and educational portfolio and gender and ethical use of power. Previously, she'd worked as a rabbi and Jewish educator in a variety of settings, including pulpits, social justice, organizations, mikvaot, hospitals, and informal and experiential education. She's been involved in leadership of several halachic egalitarian minyanim. She was ordained by the Rabbinical School of Hebrew College, where she also earned a master's in Jewish education and received private ordination from Rabbi Daniel Landes. She is an alumna of Brandeis University, Yeshivat Hadar, Pardes Institute, Drisha Institute, Beit Midrash Har, the Wexner Graduate Fellowship, and the David Hartman Center Fellowship. And it is a treat to have us with you for the month, Rabbi. So I'm going to hand things over to you to take it away. We have people watching in our Zoom and on our live stream and our YouTube as well. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Jessica. Sometimes you meet someone who starts in your life as a student and very quickly becomes also a teacher and a colleague and a mentor. So it's just been a pleasure working and thinking with you. And I'm so excited to be briefly piloting in to join and get to know your community a little. And I know the incredible work you've been doing here. So as Jessica said, I'm Sarah. I'm a rabbi of a home-based Jewish community for folks in their 20s and 30s here in Chicago, and a faculty member at the Shalom Hartman Institute, as she said. And while I was full-time at the Institute, I directed a project there called the Created Equal Project, which she mentioned, which really held all of the Institute's work on gender and the ethical use of power. So as I continue to do that work and that teaching for the Institute, and also in lots of other contexts in my work as a rabbi and mentor to young people, in my work as a teacher, also just in my life as an individual who is a member of a synagogue and a member of Jewish communities, and therefore reliant on my own rabbis and leaders, I think a lot about what makes for good and healthy Jewish leadership. And I'm really excited to be opening this series of conversations over the next month, where we will think together about what it is that we as Jewish community members need from our leaders right now, and what we can be doing as community members to support our leaders and our institutions to make that kind of really exceptional leadership in this challenging moment possible. So today I really want to start thinking together, as I said, using both the wisdom and the experience of all of us in the room, and also, of course, looking at some provocative and I think very wise Jewish texts about the following questions. So first, I just want to think about what does a leader look like? And where do we get our ideas about what a leader looks like and how a good leader behaves? Where do those ideas come from, and are the ones that we're sort of carrying around with us serving us and our community? That's question one. Question two is, assuming that maybe there are some limitations to the images that we carry around about who is a leader and what should a leader do, I want to think together a little bit about how, if and how and when we should begin to do the work of shifting our expectations of who is a leader and what we expect those leaders to do in their roles. And I want to think about sort of what's gained for our communities and also what's lost when we start to shift the conversation about leaders and leadership. And to think about, if we are going to make some of those changes, how do we do it in a way that's both effective and ethical? And finally, I want to think a little bit about, for us as community members, if we do decide that we need either a more diverse set of leaders or a more expansive idea of what leadership looks like, of different kinds of leadership styles and behaviors, what would we do as community members to make that possible, to support our leaders and our institutions to make that possible, and what kinds of impacts would that have on our community if we did that work? So that's sort of like the big question or set of questions that I'm hoping we'll bite off today and chew on a little bit. So I'll just pause there really quickly. Are there any questions, anything about that didn't make sense or that people have questions about or comments about? Okay, so I'm going to take the silence as everyone being on board to give this a try, and we're going to jump into this topic. And I want to start us right off with a fairly recent article from the New York Times. I'll share my screen and throw it up so everybody can see the article. So this is an article from just before the pandemic, to March 2018, so a couple years before the pandemic, entitled "Picture a Leader, Is She a Woman?" And actually, just to spare my voice, let me ask Judy, you happen to be the person I see first on my screen. Would you be willing to read a little from this article for us? Just have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Picture a leader. Is she a woman? Oh, that's Heather Murphy, matched blah, blah. Okay. When asked to draw a picture of an effective leader, both men and women almost always draw men. Even when the drawings are gender neutral, which is uncommon, Dr. Kiefer said, the majority of groups present the drawings using male language. Several researchers decided to investigate further. How might holding unconscious assumptions about gender affect people's abilities to recognize emerging leadership? What they found seems to confirm what many women have long suspected. Getting noticed as a leader in the workplace is more difficult for women than men. Even when a man and a woman were reading the same words off a script, only the man's leadership potential was recognized. The authors focused on one particular act associated with leadership, speaking up with ideas to move a team or company forward. In one experiment, participants were asked to call into a monthly sales team meeting of a fictional insurance company, during which they would hear from either an Eric or an Erica. Later, they were asked to rate the speaker on the degree to which he or she had exhibited leadership, influenced the team, or assumed leadership role. Okay, where am I? I lost it.
Sorry, I just moved you up.
Yeah.
The Eric.
The Erics who spoke up.
Is Erica, is that the next
Erics who
line?
spoke up.
I don't see that.
I
have Erica.
I'll pick up for you. That was my fault.
Yeah.
Yep, the Erics who spoke up with change-oriented ideas were far more likely to be identified as leaders than Erics who simply critiqued their team's performance. But Ericas did not receive any boost at all in status from sharing the ideas, even exactly the same ideas as the Erics. All right, so now do you see where we're at the top of the paragraph? So what's going on here? Yeah, Judy, pick up.
Yeah, so what's going on? People have those prototypes in their head about what a leader looks like. Dr. McLean said, when we see an individual, we ask, do they fit that? If they don't, even if they are acting like a leader, it's harder to identify them as one. This disconnect does not require assuming that women are less competent than men in general. That is, intelligent, smart, organized, level-headed. Alice Eagley a psychologist at Northwestern University and author of Through the Labyrinth, The Truth About How Women Become Leaders, wrote in an email, recently she found that many people tend to credit these qualities more to women than men. But when we process information through the lens of stereotype, our interpretation may be consistent with stereotyped expectations rather than objective reality. When people are consistently exposed to leaders who fit one profile, they will be more likely to notice leaders who fit that same profile in the future. That's how self-reinforcing confirmation bias cycle works, she said.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Judy. So just to sort of summarize, right, what we saw here was an article, a popular summary of a bunch of really fascinating social science research. And I am not a social scientist, but the big picture headline is that the research basically validated an idea or an experience that might not be a shock to us, although I will say I did find it surprising quite how deep it went and how powerful the effects were. But the simple idea is that people often carry very strong, usually subconscious images of what leaders are supposed to look like, and that those images impact how they see and react to identical behavior by people who do or do not match up to that image in their heads. Right? We don't even realize it, but we're sort of going through the world, holding people up to see how they compare to this sort of buried image in our psychology. And what this article really explored was the way that image that people carry of leaders is usually male. And that's true for people of all genders. But the same sort of phenomenon is true in terms of our racial expectations, our class expectations, our expectations for how tall leaders are, all sorts of things that we haven't even begun to explore are sort of all buried in our expectations and impacting how we interact with potential leaders and community members around us all the time. So I'm interested in folks' thoughts and reactions to this article. And I'm going to ask actually a couple of questions and ask you to jot down some notes so we all get our thoughts down on the paper, and then I'll open up the conversation. If you have a pen and paper handy, I actually really encourage you to jot it down on an old-fashioned pen and paper. If not, you can open another screen on your computer. And just jot down a few reactions to the questions I ask, and then I'll open it up. So the first question is, none of us is exempt from this. So if you have to be pushed to sort of look inside your own brain, what images do you think you carry about what a leader looks like? What are your assumptions about, the first person that comes to mind when you think leader? What's their gender? What's their race? What kind of class and education markers? Their physical build? What are the stories that you're carrying with you?
Do you want us to answer that or just keep writing?
Just jot down some notes, and then once everybody's kind of got their thoughts to a few questions, I'll open it up. Okay, so now that you've jotted just a few quick notes about what images you're carrying, any guesses or hypotheses about where you get these images? How did they get inside your brain? Okay, and one final question, which is in terms of the images that you're carrying and maybe that you assume other people in this community might be carrying, how are they impacting either people who fit those images or people who don't fit those images? Okay, so let's open it up. Anybody who feels like you want to share what came up to you in response to the article, in response to these questions? Judy, I know you had something.
Yes, I raised my other hand, okay, my virtual hand. It brought up a lot of memories to me. When I was promoted, I'm a librarian, to the head of a branch, and there were two men under me, and they took it very, very harshly that a woman was going to be supervising them. And I had trouble my whole tenure with them. And I also wanted to ask the adjectives that we always apply. Oh, it was a male nurse, a female pilot, like, is that safe? A female doctor. Oh my God. We always have to have those adjectives because of the stereotype that appears in our brain.
And what's amazing is that is true for people of all genders and actually across the political spectrum. So a person will say, I'm female, I identify as a feminist, my politics are fairly liberal, and I think I'm just as likely to make those unconscious mistakes of assuming that a pilot looks a certain way or a nurse looks a certain way, because this is happening sort of deeply buried on the level of like instincts and images in our psychology. Yeah, anybody else, what came up for you, either in response to the questions or the article? Yeah, I don't see your name. So person who is labeled as iPhone and is raising their hand with the lovely brown hair. Unmute and share your thoughts.
You need to unmute. In the meanwhile,
Okay.
Margaret Kotler, why don't you go ahead? Because Margaret has her hand
Okay.
up, and
Can you-
we'll wait for the
okay.
other person to unmute.
Well,
Margaret, go ahead.
I have a question on the Ericas that were presented versus the Erics. In other words, were they seen personally, or how were these people presented?
So I obviously didn't run the experiment, but my understanding from the article is that it was just a phone call. So all you did was hear the voices, and that the script was exactly the same. So the individual offered the same sort of ideas and sort of moved the meeting forward in the same way, whether they were an Eric or an Erica. But the result of the study was that for the Eric, being seen as presenting new ideas made it much more likely for the listeners to say that person is a leader. And for the Ericas, their sort of leadership status stayed the same. That's my understanding, although I didn't run the article.
Well, the comment I'm going to make, and you may not agree with me, but I think so often we look at, right away a man has they're larger than women usually. They have a deeper voice, which may seem more authoritative. And I think women, because our voices are not as powerful, possibly, or our stature may not be as prominent in a room, that a woman that's like 5'2" and has a higher voice, a higher pitched voice, could be brilliant. But I just think there's a lot of judgment that comes across, again, from women and men about women. They just
I think, Margaret, I think that's exactly, I think that's exactly the point, right?
That's how it is.
Right. So I think that's exactly the point of the experiment, right? The Erica's ideas were exactly the same ideas as the Eric's ideas because they were reading off the script. So the quality of the ideas may have been good, may have been bad, but it was the exact same quality of ideas. But something about, at least the hypothesis of this study are the stories that we carry about sort of what leadership looks like means that depending on who voiced those exact same ideas with the exact same quality, they were sort of either seen as leaders or not leaders. And I think some of the things you're pointing to about cultural expectations that somehow deeper voices are more worth listening to is interesting, and that taking up physically more space means that our ideas are more powerful or we have more charisma. All of this stuff, I think, is exactly kind of what we're trying to unpack. One final comment, and then I want to push us forward. Do we have one more comment? Anybody else? I thought I saw one more hand. I don't want to pass over.
I think they
anybody.
left.
Okay, great. Great. So I'll point out one other thing that really strikes me about this article, which I think is really in some ways the most important thing, which is that this whole article is really designed to try and push us, whether we agree or not, but to try and push us as the reader about our assumptions about who could be a leader, right? We're supposed to be pushed to think, oh, maybe the Ericas are just as good of leaders as the Erics. But the article has a very traditional idea of what kinds of behaviors constitute leadership. In other words, to be a leader is to speak up with change-oriented ideas or to take charge, right? It doesn't say, for example, that being a good leader is being an excellent listener or having really great facilitation skills or the ability to lift up others. So I'm not trying to make an argument for one or the other of these things. I think those are all potential leadership strengths and also all have potential weaknesses, and that there's a place for all those things. But I think it's interesting that the very article that's trying to push us and shift our stories about who is a leader actually has a pretty traditional story about how a leader behaves. And I think that really pushes to the ways in which, as difficult as it is to shift people's stories about who is a leader and what they look like, their stories about how a leader behaves is actually, I think, even harder to shift. And for me, that opens up a whole second set of questions, which is to say, let's say that we got to a place where we had a very open sense in our community about which kinds of people could take up leadership roles. But we still had a very narrow sense of how a leader behaves, really only vary one particular way. What are the positives of that, of having a kind of like a strong vision of what kind of leaders we want and have? And also, what are the negatives about sort of only having this sort of one narrow sense of what leadership can look like? And what if it's not just that our community needs different kinds of people in the corner office, but maybe we need different kinds of conceptions entirely about what a leader is and how they behave and what they do in that office, and maybe they don't even have a corner office, right? So we could probably spend our whole hour on just this one essay, but I want to move us away with just this sort of big picture takeaway that we all carry these stories, these images of what leaders look like and what they do, and that this has lots of implications for how our communities function and for anybody who leads and also for anybody who wants to follow leaders. So everybody, right? And I do think it's important to say that it is not necessarily a problem to have these clear stories about who is a leader and what leadership looks like in our communities. But, and I know I've experienced this and some other people have voiced that they've experienced this, if you are one of the people who doesn't fit into the story, it can start to feel like a problem. And more importantly, I think for our community and for all of us who are people who care about our Jewish community, if these sorts of stories are excluding categories of people or styles of leadership that would be of value to our community, then we are missing out on that value, right? And that impoverishes our communities and our institutions. My hypothesis would be that that is the case. And if we had more than an hour, I could bring lots of data to show the ways in which I think that's the case. And if so, I think part of our work as community members is helping each other and helping our communities to accept new models of what a leader looks like and how they might choose to lead. And not just because we're trying to be nice to the people who are impacted, but actually because we think it will create value for our whole community. But I just spent like 10 minutes showing you how deeply hard it is to shift these stories. So the question now is, okay, great, we've decided that's important, maybe you believe me, but how do we actually move forward in this work? And you know, there again, lots of ways we could spend a whole year, a whole semester digging into that question. But one way to think about that challenge, because I'm a rabbi and this is a Jewish tech study group, is to look at a Jewish case study where I actually think a group of Jewish leaders who, or I guess Jewish people, successfully did this. And I'll say successfully, but not uncomplicatedly, shifted our community's sense of who could be a leader and in what way they should lead. And that case study is actually the rabbis. So it's a little bit hard to remember in retrospect because we've lived for so long, literally for more than 1,000 years, in a reality where a rabbi is kind of the most obvious form of Jewish leadership. And you know, if someone were to say to you, name a Jewish leader, would it be at all surprising to come up with the image of a rabbi? But it's important for us to remember that in the biblical period, there was no such thing as a rabbi. There's no mention of rabbis in the Bible. And in the Second Temple period, right, so we're talking like 500 years before Christ to about 70 years after Christ, the the early sort of proto-rabbis were like weirdos. They were this very marginal group in the Jewish community. They were not followed by most Jews. They were really sort of seen as outsiders. And the central leaders of the Jewish community were at the time, and had been for hundreds and hundreds of years, the priests, right? The priests in the temple. That's what a Jewish leader looked like in the mind of Jews for hundreds and hundreds of years. So now we know that over time, rabbis became central leaders of the Jewish people and came to sort of supplant the priests. But that was not inevitable. It wasn't obvious, and it wasn't inevitable. These people had been in charge for hundreds of years, these priests, and it was a group that you could not join. You had to be born into it. And they exercised their leadership by performing rituals in the temple. So how did we get from that story? How did a shift happen from that story to a story where rabbis, a group that you sort of work your way into by mastering certain sets of knowledge, and a group that exercises leadership through teaching and through religious inspiration, right? It's a totally different model. So how did we get from model one to model two? What were the positives? What were the losses? And sort of what can we learn from that story that might help us think about leadership in our own community? So part of the answer, and I think it's important to say this from the beginning, is obviously that the temple was destroyed. And that was sort of the seat of the priest's power by the Romans in 70 CE. But I think it's really important to say that's not a complete answer, because the early rabbis were already building this shift and building their power long before the destruction of the temple. And also because you could easily imagine an alternative history, and there were historically proponents of this, that said the priests will stay in power after the destruction of the temple. They'll just sort of shift their role, they'll adapt to this new reality, but they'll still be our leadership class. And that is easily could have happened, and it's not what happened. And I want to think together a little bit about why. So a complete study of sort of how the rabbis came to power would not be a lunch and learn, it would be a dissertation, at least. But what I want to do in our time together is look at a few really sweet, really wise Jewish texts, which reflects the language and the stories that the rabbis use to talk about their own power and their own leadership, and the stories they tell about how they came into power and sort of replaced the priests, and to just try and get some insight into how were they able to expand the Jewish people's sense of what a Jewish leader looked like, and what a Jewish leader did. And I hope that in turn, this sort of case study will both be interesting to you in and of itself, but also enrich our own understandings of the complexities of the work around in the present day, expanding the sort of who and how of leadership. So just pausing there, people get the framing, people get the history and the story that we're going to dig into.
Wow.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's look at this. How did the rabbis do it? Or maybe a better question is, how are some of the strategies of the rabbis reflected in their own texts and stories about their leadership? So what I want to look at together now is a section from the Mishnah Torah, which is Maimonides' legal code from the Middle Ages, right? So that is a period far after this transition has already been accomplished. But this text is actually kind of an editing, this particular little section we're going to look at is sort of him editing and bringing together several early rabbinic texts, which are written during the period where the transition is still taking place. So I want to look and see sort of like what's the language that they're using to talk about the strategies that they're using. So let me throw this source back up here on the screen. All right. And it's nice and short, so we won't even have to move through it. Barbara, will you do us the honor of reading this text with the caveat that I will interrupt you rudely a couple of times? Who wouldn't want to take that deal? Yeah, so just unmute yourself and come on in and read for us in English.
Mishnah Torah, Laws of Torah Study, 3:1-2. 3 crowns were besotted upon Israel: the crown of Torah, the crown of priesthood, and the crown of monarchy. The crown of priesthood.
I'm going to pause you already right there. Okay. So 3 crowns: crown of Torah, crown of priesthood, and crown of monarchy. So that's like a weird thing to say, right? Because when you think, if I were to show, have thrown up on the screen a picture of a crown, and I would say, what kind of leader is associated with a crown? I think you might have come up with kings and queens, right? You might have come up with monarchy. right? This is a leadership symbol, which is primarily associated with the monarchy. That's true for us. It was true for ancient Jews. And also to a lesser extent, possibly a crown is associated with priesthood. They did have a sort of special kind of hat thing that they wore. But it's not associated with rabbis, right? It's not. We don't wear crowns. And so what's happening here is they're sort of very smoothly, right, is the text is taking this recognizable symbol of leadership that people get, right, a crown, which is primarily associated with kings, with the monarchy, and they're sort of affirming that that also applies to Torah scholars, right? It's not literally true, but they're taking this known image of leadership and sort of putting themselves inside it and saying, yeah, okay, that thing that looks like power to you, yeah, we have that too, right? Kings have it, priests have it, and we have it too, right? The rabbis are establishing a continuity between their own very new leadership and leadership models that people are already familiar with and already accept. They're saying, yeah, you know this thing, it's very comfortable, we're inside of it too. All right, that's move one. Okay, Barbara, take us through the next little bit.
The crown of priesthood, Aaron merited it, and it is said, and it will be for him and his prodigy as an everlasting covenant of service. Numbers 2:25-13. The crown of monarchy, David merited it. As it is said, his prodigy will be forever, and his throne will be before me like the sun. Psalm 89.
Okay, amazing. Perfect. So I'll pause you there. So here we have like the next step, right? Which is that one of the most obvious differences between rabbinic leadership and priests and kings is the difference between an inherited leadership, right? You can't just like decide to be the king or a priest. You have to be the son of the king or the priest, versus a sort of merit-based leadership model, right? You can become a rabbi if you can learn a certain set of information and sort of rise up in this meritocratic system. So what Maimonides is doing here, and the earlier text that he's drawing on, is pushing the rabbinic leadership model even further into the recognizable mold by sort of blurring that like very key difference, right? So not only are rabbis sort of wearers of a crown the way kings are, but actually those old leaders who you think are really different from us, they're actually more like us than you might have thought at first glance, right? The claim is that the monarchy and the priesthood are, like rabbis, actually at their root a merit-based system, right? Or at least more merit-based than they might originally seem, because yeah, they're dynastic, but the dynasties were originally established because of some individual's merit. Okay, so yeah, like family pedigree determines how it gets passed on from generation to generation, but at the beginning, the priesthood was in some sense a merit-based system. The monarchy was in some sense a merit-based system, just like us, right? So this thing that looks like a huge difference, the text is sort of trying in its language to blur it and say like, no, we're more like them, or actually they're more like us than you would have thought at first glance. So what we're doing, it's not really as radical as you might have thought. Okay, Barbara, take us to the end now.
The crown of Torah, behold, it is available to all, as it is said, an inheritance for the congregation of Jacob, Deuteronomy 33:4. All who wish may come and take.
Great. And so now the argument is made in the reverse, right? This is the flip side. Just like those kings and those priests that you're familiar with as leaders, our new rabbinic form of leadership is also, in a certain sense, dynastic, right? Sure, in this case, it's not literally passed from parent to child, although that does seem to happen sometimes, both in our rabbinic families and in theirs. But it's sort of like a kind of collectively dynastic, right? It is the inheritance of the descendants of Jacob, right? To use this language of inheritance is to say, okay, we still fit into that old model in a certain way. We look like them. So we might be very different people. The ways in which we lead, right, like teaching Torah rather than slaughtering animals in the temple is like a very different kind of leadership, but we sort of fit into this mold that you're already comfortable with, right? So they're working really hard to make their very new model of leadership look similar in sort of fundamental ways And then sort of equal to, and maybe even there's a hint of better than, but at least equal to these other models of leadership that the community is already familiar with, already was comfortable with, right? So this is a strategy. This is a choice, right? They are new leaders who sort of want to be the leaders of the community. And instead of saying, we're going to build our own model, we're going to highlight how it's different and better, and then we're going to try and convince people to choose ours over that old one, they instead say, rather than fighting for that kind of legitimacy, we're going to try and get in on the model that sort of already exists, harness its power, and then like divert it to our new project, right? So rather than standing outside and saying like, come over to our thing, we're going to try and get in and like shift the model from the inside. And we're going to do this as a strategy, right? It helps people feel stable while you're actually doing something quite new, right? You're using the language that they associate with the current familiar kinds of leaders, but you're actually pushing for a totally different set of people, right? Any Jewish man who accomplishes some amount of learning can be a rabbi, as opposed to only male descendants of Aaron who are physically able to do temple rituals can be priests. And a really different set of ways to lead, right? Again, teaching Torah versus slaughtering bulls. But it's going to feel less radical because we're using that old category. We're using that old language. So I just want to pause there. Just first of all, like check. Do people feel like they follow? Like what is this strategy that the rabbis are using to make their kind of radical move feel familiar? Yeah, questions about that? Jessica, please, Rabbi Jessica.
It reminds me of when we try and talk about equality, being kind to people, and people say like, my blood is as red as yours, or things like that. Like, I feel like that, you know, especially like with medical understanding until modern times, like there are different people in different societies who would say like, we're better or we're not better, you know, up until the Nazis or even, you know, today. And so it like the language of saying my blood, you know, is the same color as your blood, no matter what color your skin is. But the one place where that differs is like monarchy is given on, you know, through blood transmission. So it's interesting, but it just and
so it's priesthood, right?
Right. And it just reminds me of like, it's such a great strategy to reframe things. And I always, you know, it's funny, I always say like, I'm a female rabbi until I'm with a family at a funeral, and then I'm just a rabbi. And you know, I think, but I just like it as a strategy, like that thousands of years ago, they said, we're going to reframe this in a way where people are going to take this familiar symbol and this new idea and marry them. It's a brilliant strategy.
Yeah, they're coming into a society that's like got a very like a hierarchical thing of like only certain people can inherit the leadership, only certain people's blood is red enough. And they're saying, you know, this is Morasha Kilat Yaakov. Like every Jew is like entitled to that kind of level of importance if they sort of fight for it. And I think you're right. Like, again, to use this language of strategy. And that's what I would love to think about, which is like, what is it about this kind of strategy where you integrate the new groups and the new models into the old model that's effective? And actually also the flip side, like, are there dangers, are there costs, are there losses in that kind of strategy? Like, what's good about working in this? Yeah, exactly. So what's good about working in this way, and like what maybe is less good? So I see Judy, and who else do we have here?
Margaret and Judy.
And Margaret. Great. So Judy and then Margaret, come on in.
Lorraine as well.
Great. Judy, Margaret, Lorraine, in that order. Oh, Judy, you've got to unmute yourself. Oh,
right,
I think, while Judy, while you work on the unmute, let's go to Margaret.
Well, I think the way the world is going now, that soon there's not going to be that connotation, oh, it's a female rabbi. I think, as everyone knows, the amount of females going to rabbinic school that are becoming cantors, it's starting to shift. So it may not be in my lifetime, but soon there's not going to be that. It may be it's a male rabbi. maybe not in the Orthodox
Right.
I was
community.
gonna say
No,
in
I
certain
think-
branches.
The communities at all. I know it's silly.
No,
but
I think that's no, I think
that.
it's important. And one of the things that we will look at is, when that transition has been accomplished, how do the people who accomplish the transition sort of look at the next group after them? Like, are they like, oh, we fought, and so we're going to hold the door open for you? Or do they sort of forget, and now that they're on the inside, they forget the people who are on the outside? But yes, you are right. It is true that particularly in the Reform community, there are now, I think, as many, if not more, female rabbinical students as men. And it is also true that if you sort of go on Google Image or stock photos and put in rabbi, you don't get somebody who looks like me as your picture back. You get a picture of a white man with a black hat, and right. So we still have work to do, but you're right. Things are moving forward. Judy, I
Judy's
see
unmuted.
you unmuted. Yes, come on.
Oh. I have a question, or you can educate me on it. Of course, the priesthood is inherited. The Kohanes are still Kohanes going all the way back and up till now. Whether they were capable or not, I guess it didn't matter. But did the sacrifices in the temple end at the destruction of the temples?
Yeah. So when the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 by the Roman army, there was some small amount of tension in the Jewish community about whether some sacrificial worship might continue outside of the temple. But basically, the consensus fairly quickly was that sacrificial rite would not continue outside the temple. Already for many hundreds of years, there have been a very strong idea that sacrificial rite could only happen inside the temple. But it was not clear that the priests necessarily wouldn't continue to be leaders in different kinds of ways. And that tension went on for quite a while longer, right? Even if they weren't going to have the temple and do the service, maybe they were still going to be sort of the leadership class, or maybe they weren't, and in the end, they weren't. So yes, the rituals ended with the destruction of the physical space for the most part, but the tensions around the leadership started earlier and went longer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I just have one last question about when historically did rabbis become leaders?
It's a great question. So already in the Second Temple period, there are sort of proto-rabbinic groups of people who are coming together in circles to teach and to create Torah texts, like we're not the literal Bible, but commentaries and Jewish legal texts. But it seems that they were a pretty marginal group through that period, and even for a few hundred years after the destruction of the temple. It's really sort of like a chunk of Jewish history that's a little bit lost to scholarship, but it seems like the rabbis really only become central leaders of the Jewish community in what's called the Gaonic period, as a sort of post-Talmudic period. So we're talking about the year 500, the year 600. So it's a long, slow process from the rabbis to go from sort of an enclave to kind of a bunch of guys on the sidelines doing their Torah learning thing to the real leaders of the community. It's a process that takes several hundred years. 300, 400, 500, 600 years after the destruction of the temple, maybe it's still going. This is the kind of thing Jewish studies scholars fight about.
Just have
And
one more.
Lorraine.
Wait, Judy, let me give Lorraine a chance. Hold on.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Do I wait till my name?
Go say your question.
Go for it, Lorraine.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm confounded by this whole discussion. The rabbis that I know are real people. The rabbis that I know that I associate with at Temple Bethel, I feel like I can ask any of them any question, and I can be straightforward with them. I think that all of this talking about the history of rabbis is less valid today than it's less followed. We have a complicated world. We're full of problems of all kinds. And what I don't need, and what a lot of us don't need, is to worry about whether our rabbis are good or not. We have good rabbis. We have great rabbis here. I'm very
Right.
proud of
Yeah.
all of them.
Lorraine,
And
I
I'm
think
sorry
what,
to-
Absolutely.
right. I
You
think
have
what
the
sorry
she's,
best rabbis from what I could tell.
right.
No,
I think
no,
what
not at
she's
all.
saying,
You have,
right.
So-
I think what
You-
she's
you
saying
have
is
the-
that we got to this place because a couple thousand years ago, it wasn't so easy to transition from the community respecting, it's not like it happened overnight in the same way, like the Holocaust was only, 75 years ago, the civil rights movement was only, whatever it is, 50 years ago. Like we live in that now. She's trying to explain some of the history. Sarah, I want to make sure you have time to get through your text. So
no, it's fine. I think what you're saying is so important, right? Our rabbis now are incredible leaders for the Jewish community. So exactly what we're trying to do is say, like, how did it happen that the Jewish community chose to say, like, the people we're going to hold up as our leaders are the people who study Jewish texts, like the people who can teach Torah and counsel, and exactly as you said, Lorraine, who will answer my questions. That was not at all obvious that that should be our model. We used to have different models. And I think there's something really interesting about the fact that we chose that and that we've really committed to that. And I think you're right. You have the best rabbi. So that's exactly what I'm interested in, is like, what does it look like for a community to choose a particular model and sort of run with it? So I actually think maybe this next text is helpful for looking at the question of how this process, what does it look like as that transition is happening? And what are some of the tensions that come up between the old guard and the new? Like, right, I want to look at a story from the Talmud, a story written by rabbis about tensions between the old kinds of leaders, the priests, and them, and the rabbis, the earliest rabbis. So let me throw it up on the screen, and I'll just read it really quickly for us. So we have the story. So this is a story from the Talmud in the section about Yom Kippur, Yoma. And that's important because the Yom Kippur in the period where the temple stood was like, the biggest day of the year for the priest, and particularly for the high priest, right? The idea was that he was going to go into the Holy of Holies and he was going to do something that was hard and literally life-threatening, right? A danger to his own life on behalf of the community. And by doing that, he was going to expiate the community's sins for them. So this was sort of the pinnacle of his leadership year, the moment where he did the hardest thing and took on the greatest risk and also gave the most to his community. And I think we see echoes of this and how hard our current day rabbis work on the high holidays too, but like really like the pinnacle of his year. And the story tells us that after he did this, the high priest would make a big party for all of his friends and family. And the rabbis tell us that once there was a high priest who came out of the temple on the Day of Atonement after achieving atonement for the people, and everybody's following him, right? You just picture the crowds are like walking after him and cheering. And then they saw Shmaya and Avtalion. Now, Shmaya and Avtalion are like the sort of earliest proto-rabbis, like the very beginning of the rabbinic project. And the people left the high priest and followed Shmaya and Avtalion instead. So they kind of like mid-party on the biggest day of the year, switched their allegiances. And at the end of the party, Shmaya and Avtalion went over to the high priest to say goodbye to him. And he said to them, let the children of the nations, i.e., hey, you Gentiles, or maybe even a less nice way of saying that, may you goyim go in peace. So why does he say this to them? Because Shmaya and Avtalion, the sort of progenitors of the rabbinic project, were actually the children of converts. Their parents had converted to the Jewish community. So it's like the strongest contrast you could possibly imagine. The priest, the high priest, the descendant of Aaron, right, the purest of the purebloods, and Shmaya and Avtalion, the leaders of this like early marginal rabbinic movement, themselves, the children of people who have chosen to join the Jewish people. And he throws that in their face, right, at this moment where it's supposed to be his party and people have gone to their party instead. And he says, oh, you guys, I know who you are. And they respond, let the children of the nations who behave like Aaron, the original high priest, be in peace, and not the actual descendant of Aaron, meaning you, who does not behave like Aaron, have peace, right? So in other words, they say, okay, yeah, like you're the physical descendant of Aaron, but look at how you're acting, right? Insulting someone because their parents are converts is like the lowest thing, the most horrible way to act. And they're saying like, like you might be Aaron's descendants, but we're Aaron's rightful heirs because our behavior is more in line with his behavior. Our values are more in line with Aaron's values, right? So they're sort of making a declaration that fundamentally shifts the story as saying, like, what it is to be a priest is to be in this biblical paradigm where you have this biological pedigree, to this other paradigm is like what it really is to be a descendant of Aaron is to follow in his character, and that's what they're trying to do, right? So they're making a really radical argument, right? Not only are they saying, like we saw in the previous text, like, okay, this is what leaders look like, we're in that category too. Now they're saying, we're not only in the same category with you, we actually fill that category even better than you guys, right? You might, like, we're priestier than the priests, right? Because you might be like descended from Aaron physically, but we are the ones who are the descendants of his values, and we're the sort of more legitimate leaders, right? So I think this text is really interesting, right? Because it shows this kind of moment where the new leaders are saying, not only are we wanting to be alongside the old leaders, but actually we're more legitimate. And I think we could think about, what are the gains and what are the losses of that moment where it's not just, I want to lead alongside, but actually I want to lead instead of. And also, I think this story is important because it's a really painful story, right? Like, this is supposed to be his big day. He's just like gone to personal risk and tremendous amount of work to care for the Jewish people, and they kind of like leave him at the altar and like go chasing after the rabbis. Now, whether or not that's true, this is obviously literature. It's obviously written by rabbis, but there's something very painful about the anger with which he lashes out at the new guard, the sort of immediacy with which the new leaders kind of like declare the old ones as like not useful and not having anything still to give. It's like a very painful story, and it like leads me to ask, like, are there ways to expand the leadership group without getting into this place where there becomes such anger between the groups, where it becomes a question of supplanting as opposed to working alongside. And just to sort of close the loop, like you can see how this dynamic sort of comes to fruition in the last text I'm going to show you. Let me just share my screen one last time, which is a text written by Shmaya and Avtalion's students. So Hillel and Shammai, the sort of famous, first generation rabbis, like leaders of this newly formed rabbinic movement, they are the students of Shmaya and Avtalion, and Hillel teaches, right, this sort of beautiful quote from Pirkei Avot: "Be of the students of Aaron, one who loves peace and pursues peace, who loves all people or all creation and brings them close to Torah." So this is like a beautiful idea, but also you can see here how the priests have been totally edited out of the story. Right now, Aaron doesn't have sons; he has students. And that's because priests don't have students, rabbis have students, right? So now we're not talking about Aaron's sons anymore. We're talking about his students. And we're talking about, like, who was Aaron in the story now that Hillel is telling? Well, it has nothing to do with being in the priesthood, nothing to do with being in the temple, nothing to do with the rituals. Like, Aaron suddenly becomes this person who has attributes of pursuing peace and of teaching Torah. Like, suddenly he looks very rabbi-like. Right? So now not only have we said we are leaders alongside the priests, we're even maybe better leaders than the priests. Now we're not even talking about the priests anymore. They're not even in the story. We're just using the metaphor of Aaron really to describe a category that, like, they're not a part of at all, and that we are now at the center of, like, we the rabbis, and now we stand alone. So I think in just these three little texts, you can really see the arc of what happens here of a group being very marginal, sort of inserting themselves into the story, and then sort of taking over the category. So yeah, I just want to open up in our last few minutes to ask you, I don't think this is a simple story. I think there are some real things to learn from what the rabbis did, and some real like losses and sadnesses here. And so I'd love to just in our last 5 or 6 minutes here sort of open up for your conversation of, like, do you think that we as a community need new kinds of leaders, new models of leadership? And if so, who are they? What kinds are they? And how do we bring them in ways that are successful and effective, but not quite this painful story where they push others out? And what can we as community members do to sort of open up our leadership to lots of different kinds of people who want to serve our communities without doing this kind of damage that we see in this story, even that the rabbis tell about their own successes, but the losses that were inherent in them. So I'll just open up for any thoughts about how do we build like healthy dynamics between our communities and our leaders? How do we make these transitions in ways that work? Anything that's coming up for folks.
There's a great book called Here Comes Everybody by Clay Sharkey, which is about how it'll take 50 years, like for the internet, it's going to take 50 years and a lot of transition in order for it to be like part of society in the way, like when the printing press was invented, it took 50 years. And like, you just think about timelines. I think we're sitting in the midst of this right now and a lot of things, especially related to gender and equity and race. And so it's like, you know, not being able to see the forest for the trees sometimes. It's very interesting to look at
Totally.
a process of transition, you know, of changing something when we're sitting in our own time, plus COVID on top of everything, you know, our own time of transition. So it's it's just like.
Totally,
stopping
right.
to
I think
reflect.
if you have this sort of arc, we're like for sure right in the messy middle in terms of what it means to bring people of different kinds of gender into leadership, racial diversity, class diversity, and I think in some ways even more so, like different models of leadership now that you know, in the COVID world and the internet world and whatever, like do leaders even do the same kinds of things that they did 50 years ago? Like we're right in the messy middle. And so I think it's useful to look back at some of these historical case studies and say like what went right and what went wrong. You know, one thing, we didn't have time to really get to this text, but I'll just show this last text. So you see it, which is one really interesting thing that happens is that immediately after the rabbis sort of finally win and become in power, so this last text is the students of Hillel and Shammai, they start to argue about whether people can be rabbis if they're not descended from rabbis. Like, should you accept students into the rabbinic academy who aren't themselves the sons of rabbis? So in other words, they fought so hard, right? Shemaiah and Avtalion fought so hard to say, like, it doesn't matter who our parents were, like, we have something to give to the Jewish community. And then, you know, as soon as like their team wins, they're like shutting other people out. So I think looking at these kinds of historic case studies while we're in the messy middle is a great way to think about, you know, what is brilliant about this strategy of sort of like creating continuity while you do something radical, and really where are their losses? Where did they kind of gain blinders? Where did they leave others out? Where did they disrespect what came before? And hopefully we can do better in our own messy middle. Yeah. Anybody else? Thoughts, comments, questions?
Judy, do you want to ask your question from earlier?
I can't even remember what I was going to comment on. I guess it's because I'm doing Daf Yomi, Rabbi. So I'm reading all this.
Wow.
And everybody's a Rav. Everybody they quote who's fighting with the other ones, they're all rabbis.
Yeah.
Right, so it permeated.
Yeah, well,
Right.
well, I think, you know, reading the Talmud, you know, and studying the Talmud as I have been so privileged to do for so many years of my life and as a great love of mine, you get inside their world to the extent where like you think everybody is a rabbi. But if you do a little sort of zooming out and reading history and scholarship of the period, it's actually a very small set of a few hundred people and nobody else is listening to them. They're all talking, if you're inside a bubble, the rabbis are all talking to each other, and the Talmud is a place of great brilliance and wisdom. But it's interesting to think about, like, how did that bubble grow to encompass the Jewish world to the extent that Judy, you and I are learning Daf Yomi? Like, what, you know, that was not what the rabbi, they really thought of themselves as like a sort of small group at that period. So it's really interesting for me as somebody who, and I'll close with this, wants to think about, like, how could our communities be richer and healthier and weather the many storms better if we were able to really draw on the best of people of all different kinds of backgrounds. You know, I think some of my greatest teachers are people who discovered Judaism and converted to Judaism as adults because they have such a richness of perspective. But in this worldview that we saw in some of these texts, like they would not be leaders, right? As a woman in some of these worldviews that we saw, I would not be a leader, and I hope I give richness to my community. So I think it's useful to look back at these stories and say, what did the rabbis do so brilliantly that we could maybe imitate their strategies and also win our battles? And where did they make their mistakes in sort of not continuing to draw on what the old guard had to give, and also in not holding the door open after them for other groups that came after them? And how can we sort of learn from their successes and hopefully be protected from their mistakes?
Rabbi, we have
so
a hard stop at
I'll
1.
pause there.
Oh,
Yes,
okay,
thank you
thank
so
you.
much.
I want to thank Jake, our awesome producer, Canner Jake, for being with us. And as you can see, Sarah has the ability to reach through the screen and elicit conversation. It is very hard to teach on Zoom, and she, like no one else, has the ability to elicit dialogue and conversation and teaching. And it's just such an honor to have you with us. Those who are watching on our other platforms, think about joining the Zoom next week, just so that you can be more a part of the conversation. As you see, there's a lot of give and take as well. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Take
Very
care.
nice.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Bye. Be well. Bye-bye.